The Place of Liberty. Introduction. Liberty and Equality. Preface. In chapters 1 and 2 are argued for a conception of equality according to which ideal equality consists in circumstances in which people are equal not in their welfare but in the resources at their command. What are the implications for liberty of that claim about equality? The question is limited in two ways. First, I mean by liberty what is sometimes called negative liberty, freedom from legal constraint, not freedom or power more generally. Second, I am interested not in liberty generally, but only in the connection between liberty and distributional equality. So there I shall defend a characteristic thesis of liberalism, that people's liberty over matters of great personal concern should not be infringed. I shall defend that thesis only against challenges grounded in distributional arguments. I shall not consider moralistic or paternalistic challenges to liberalism. I shall not consider the argument, for example, that liberty in matters of religion must be abolished in order to ensure everyone's salvation. There are, of course, fundamentalist political movements, like the moral majority, that oppose liberalism on grounds of that sort, but distributional challenges to liberalism are, I believe, of greater political importance now than moralistic or political ones. It is a popular opinion that certain liberties, including freedom of choice in education, must be limited in order to achieve true economic equality, for example. It is also a popular opinion, though in different quarters, that other liberties, including freedom of sexual choice, must be limited in order to give the majority the moral environment it wishes to have and is entitled to have as a matter of distributional justice. I do consider arguments against liberalism of that character. I try to defend, however, a much more general claim, that if we accept equality of resources as the best conception of distributional equality, liberty becomes an aspect of equality rather than, as it is often thought to be, an independent political ideal potentially in conflict with it. My argument for that thesis is complex, and it might be well to provide, in advance, an informal description of the main ideas that the argument develops. Many of us believe that what we consider the morally important liberties, freedom of speech, religion, and conviction, and freedom of choice in important personal matters, for example, should be protected except in the most extreme circumstances, and we would be reluctant to think that these liberties should be abridged even for the sake of gains in equality. But the latter view is very hard to defend. We are willing to limit even important liberties for the sake of other goals, after all. We limit freedom of speech in various ways to protect ourselves from unwanted noise at inconvenient times, and we limit freedom of choice in education to ensure that children receive competent schooling. But if these important liberties yield to competing values of that sort, why should they not yield to the normally more imperative requirements of distributional justice? If liberty were valuable in the way some people think art can be valuable, for its own sake, quite apart from its impact on those who enjoy it, then we might be able to understand, if not to approve, the view that liberty is of such fundamental metaphysical importance that it must be protected whatever the consequences for people. But liberty seems valuable to us only because of the consequences we think it does have for people. We think lives led under circumstances of liberty are better lives just for that reason. Can it really be more important than the liberty of some people be protected to improve the lives those people lead than that other people, who are already worse off, have the various resources and other opportunities that they need to lead decent lives? How could we defend that view? We might be tempted to dogmatism, to declare our intuition that liberty is a fundamental value that must not be sacrificed to equality, and then claim that no more can or needs to be said. But that is hollow and too callous. If liberty is transcendently important, we should be able to say something, at least, about why. Those are among my reasons for thinking that any appeal in defense of the morally important liberties must proceed in a different, less conventional way, not by insisting that liberty is more important than equality, but by showing that these liberties must be protected according to the best view of what distributional equality is, the best view of when a society's distribution of property treats each citizen with equal concern. That claim seems plausible if we accept equality of resources as the best view. Other conceptions of equality define an equal distribution through a metric that is insensitive to the distinct quality and value of liberty. Equality of welfare, understood as the satisfaction of tastes and preferences, for example, defines an equal distribution as one in which people's preferences are equally satisfied, and since it is a contingent matter how much people prefer liberty to other resources they might secure by its sacrifice, it seems dubious that protecting the morally important liberties will always be justified as improving equality of welfare. Equality of resources, on the other hand, provides an account of distributional equality that is immediately and obviously sensitive to the special character and importance of liberty. It makes an equal distribution depend not on a bare outcome that can be measured directly, like preference satisfaction, but on a process of coordinated decisions in which people who take responsibility for their own ambitions and projects, and who accept as part of that responsibility that they belong to a community of equal concern, are able to identify the true costs of their own plans to other people, and so design and redesign these plans so as to use only their fair share of resources in principle available to all. Whether an actual society approaches equality of resources depends, then, on the adequacy of the process of discussion and choice it provides for that purpose. A substantial degree of liberty is necessary to make any such process adequate because the true cost to others of one person's having some resource or opportunity can be discovered only when people's ambitions and convictions are authentic and their choices and decisions reasonably well tailored to those ambitions and convictions. Neither is possible unless liberty is ample. So liberty is necessary to equality, according to this conception of equality, not on the doubtful and fragile hypothesis that people really value the important liberties more than other resources, but because liberty, whether or not people do value it above all else, is essential to any process in which equality is defined and secured. That does not make liberty instrumental to distributional equality any more than it makes the latter instrumental to liberty. The two ideas rather merge in a fuller account of when the law governing the distribution and use of resources treats everyone with equal concern. It follows that equality of resources requires us to take a different view of political controversies, like the controversy over private education and private medicine, that are widely thought to present a stark choice between liberty and equality. If limiting freedom of choice in education and medicine really would improve equality of resources, as some limitations plainly would, then no defensible ideal of liberty would be compromised, and liberals should have no objection. But not every infringement of liberty that is said to promote equality of resources really does so, and infringing the liberties liberals are most concerned to protect, the morally most important liberties, could rarely, if ever, count as a contribution to equality so understood. Equality of resources provides a more convincing explanation of our intuitive convictions about the importance of liberty than any theory according to which liberty and equality are independent and sometimes conflicting virtues. C'est toujours toi qui es là? That is an advanced summary of the issues considered and the conclusions proposed in this chapter. I must try to show in some detail which liberties are particularly important to an adequate process of reflection and decision in service of equality, and which liberties, on the contrary, must be limited to improve that process. I must try to show why the morally important liberties must be regarded as particularly invulnerable to such abridgment, and how far equality of resources can provide a practical guide to the steps that an unequal society might take by limiting liberty in the direction of greater equality. These are complex matters, and my argument is accordingly dense. Mais non, regarde, vous êtes trois là déjà. Oula, faut se calmer par contre. Hey, a famous conflict. En plus, toi, Geoffrey, tu dis MDR. Non mais, sérieux. Do liberty and equality often conflict, as is widely supposed? Must an egalitarian society cheat the liberty of its citizens? Or can the two virtues be reconciled so that we can have all we should anyway want of each? Oui. If so, is this reconciliation a happy and perhaps temporary accident? Or are the two virtues tied together in some more conceptual way, so that compromising one necessarily violates the other? I am for that option. We shall need examples of situations in which liberty and equality are thought to conflict, and I draw these from actual political controversies in Britain and the United States. Alors, pour info, Geoffrey, c'est mon mec. Ok. Campaign expenditure. In 1974, Congress enacted a statute that limited the amount any one person could lawfully spend to advance the interests of a particular political candidate. D'accord. Moi je lis. Il y a une note. See Federal Election Campaign Act Amendments of 1974, Public Law. Bah non, je vais pas voir ça. Ouais, ah oui, d'accord, non mais je comprends que dalle. Bon. The statute's aim was egalitarian. A rich person allowed to spend as much as he or she wishes in politics. T'as vu ça? He or she. Quoi? He or she. Wishes in politics will have a much larger impact on the political process than a poor person. The Supreme Court nevertheless held that the constraint violated the freedom of speech protected by the First Amendment, and declared that part of this statute unconstitutional. Unconstitutional. Okay. The court's decision has been widely challenged. See John Rawls, The Basic Liberties and Their Priority in Liberty, Equality and Law, Selected Tanner Lectures on Moral Philosophy. Private sector in basic needs. The second issue is one lively in British politics. Britain has a national health service. People with sufficient means or who hold jobs providing the necessary health insurance as a fringe benefit may nevertheless pay for private medical care, which allows them, among other benefits, to jump the queue for treatment of painful and incapacitating disease. Some sections of the Labour Party favour abolishing private medicine through laws that would forbid private arrangements for medical care in the interests of equality. But most British politicians and apparently most of the British public reject that policy on the ground that it would violate an important part of their liberty, freedom of choice in medical care. Ah mais t'es toujours là toi? Oui. Minimum wage and maximum hour legislation. My third example has a more historical character, though the issue it presents is, as I shall argue much later, of continuing contemporary importance. Early in this century, US state legislatures began to regulate employment contacts by limiting the hours people might be employed to work during a week or day, or by stipulating minimum wages an employer might offer his employees. New York, for example, forbade bakers to work for more than 60 hours a week. Though the aims of such laws were no doubt mixed, the New York Statute was defended as a health measure, the laws were widely welcomed as ameliorating the savage economic inequality many people were beginning to find intolerable. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court declared that New York regulation unconstitutional because, the court said, it infringed another important liberty of constitutional standing, freedom of choice in contract and employment. Ça, c'est intéressant. Lochner. The decision is no longer followed. See Day Bright Lightning, Missouri, West Coast Hotel, Parish. And it is often cited as the second worst decision in the court's history, yielding in dishonor only to Dred Scott, and as a minatory example of the dangers of encouraging the justices to enforce their own views of political morality. Most of the critics of the decision seem to agree, however, that the case did present a conflict between liberty and equality. They criticize the court only for insisting on its own preferred ranking of the two political ideals in place of the ranking the New York legislature had made. These examples are arresting not only as cases in which liberty and equality are said to conflict, but as stories that seem to show how unimportant, for some people, equality really is. Few people would object to limits on even important freedoms if these limits served some other compelling purpose. Everyone agrees that freedom of speech may be constrained in order to prevent riots or stampedes, for example, and no one objects to regulation of medicine in the interests of health or safety. The Supreme Court, in Lochner, agreed that if the evidence had shown that New York's statute was justified as necessary to protect the health of bakers, the statute would be constitutional. Our examples, and the host of other political controversies they represent, are controversial only because in each case liberty is thought to conflict with equality rather than with something else. So we may add another question to our initial list. Why should so many people think that equality counts for much less in supposed conflicts with liberty than other values or interests? If someone accepts that rights to liberty must yield to a variety of important competing interests, why should he not concede that, at least sometimes, equality is among these competing interests? A cynical answer suggests itself, of course, that many people reject equality because they are selfish. There is, I believe, a better, though perhaps not inconsistent, answer. Most of the people who seem to reject equality, in cases like our examples, do not actually reject it. They think equality very important indeed, but they do not think that the form in which equality is at stake in these cases is the important or genuine form of that virtue. I must explain and expand on that suggestion. B. The two senses of two ideas. We use the words liberty and equality in two senses. We use each as a flat description that carries in itself no suggestion of endorsement or complaint, and we also use each normatively to identify a political virtue or ideal that we do endorse. We use liberty in its flat sense simply to indicate the absence of constraint. Someone may say, using that sense, that liberty is reduced by laws prohibiting murder and theft, without implying that he opposes these laws. We use liberty in its normative sense, on the other hand, to describe the ways in which we believe people ought to be free. Americans use liberty in that second, normative, way when they say that liberty flourishes in their country and languishes elsewhere. They do not mean that people have more license in America, but that people are more free in the specific ways contemplated by liberty as a political virtue to think and speak as they wish, for example. We use equality in its flat sense simply to indicate sameness or identity along some specified or understood dimension without suggesting that the speaker believes sameness along that dimension is desirable. Someone can say, using that flat sense, that equality holds among people who all have the same wealth or ability or happiness, without implying that sameness of wealth or ability or happiness is appropriate. We use equality in its normative sense, on the contrary, precisely to indicate the respects in which the speaker thinks people should be the same or treated the same way as a matter of justice. When someone says that equality is possible only under socialism, he means that socialism is necessary not for people to be the same in some respect or other, but to be the same in the respect he thereby declares to be the important one. Political philosophers who worry about conflicts between liberty and equality have the normative, not the flat sense of these ideas in mind. They worry because they fear a conflict between political ideals, not just between descriptive properties. In any case, it is the conflict of normative ideals that I shall be exploring here. See liberty, rights, not license. Anyone who embraces liberty or equality as a normative ideal must have some opinion about the ways in which people should be free and the respects in which they should be the same or treated the same, and different people will have different opinions. Liberty and equality, in other words, are concepts that admit of different interpretations or conceptions. Whether we think liberty and equality conflict as ideals will undoubtedly depend on which conceptions of each we adopt. We can easily construct a conception of liberty such that liberty must obviously and inevitably conflict with any plausible conception of equality. An extreme anarchist conception of liberty, for example, which stipulated that people must be free to do whatever they might wish no matter what the consequences for others, would plainly conflict with equality, as it would with almost any other political virtue or goal. A society that forbids neither murder, nor theft, nor walking on the grass when that would injure common property cannot be egalitarian, nor can it be secure, prosperous, or powerful or pleasant. Important. We can also construct a conception of liberty with the opposite consequence, that liberty could never conflict with equality. If we stipulate, for example, that respecting liberty means allowing citizens to act in ways that produce and protect equality among them, then it is trivially true that liberty and equality cannot conflict. Neither of these old conceptions of liberty is satisfactory, however, because neither presents liberty as a distinct and compelling political ideal, as something whose sacrifice or compromise should in itself be a matter for regret. A more plausible conception of liberty will emerge from the argument later. Since the case for that conception will begin in the hypothesis that liberty and equality do not conflict, however, we must not rely on it when we are considering, in the earlier parts of this chapter, whether to accept or reject that hypothesis. We will do better, in fact, not to rely on any one detailed conception of liberty for that purpose. We did only assume that any acceptable conception that captures the special importance of liberty will meet certain conditions, and then ask whether and in what circumstances a conception of liberty meeting those conditions will conflict with the demands of equality. I assume that any acceptable conception will reject the anarchist view of liberty as license. It will not count every constraint on the freedom of citizens to act as they might wish as an invasion of their liberty. Instead, it will identify rights to certain designated freedoms as essential to liberty and stipulate that government must not limit those freedoms without some special justification more powerful or compelling than the justification it requires for other political decisions, including constraints and other freedoms not protected by such rights. These rights include, at a minimum, rights to freedom of conscience, commitment, speech, and religion, and to freedom of choice in matters touching central or important aspects of an agent's personal life, like employment, family arrangements, sexual privacy, and medical treatment. Different people will add further and different rights to this list. They will rank differently the various rights they recognize and take different views about which emergencies or urgent social goals would justify constraints on the freedoms the rights otherwise protect. But the dominant conceptions of liberty in our political community have this general structure. They protect not liberty as license, but a set of discrete rights to particular freedoms. Liberty is widely thought to be in peril in our sample cases, for example, only because the freedom threatened in each case is regarded as special and protected by a right, the right to freedom of choice in speech or medical treatment or employment. D. Equality. The shadow over liberty. We shall mainly be considering whether liberty, so understood, conflicts with a particular conception of equality of resources, that I defended in Chapter 2. But it will be helpful first to consider the consequences of a conflict between liberty and any conception of equality, including that one. It is widely thought that if liberty and equality do conflict, an agonizing choice between the two virtues must be made. A familiar map of political argument, in fact, locates political parties or groups along a spectrum defined by the choices each makes in that situation. The spectrum runs between an absolutism of liberty at one end, liberty must never yield to equality when the two conflict, and a reverse absolutism of equality at the other. More moderate views supposedly arrange themselves between these two poles by assigning different relative weights on the two political virtues. But this popular topography is, I believe, deeply misleading as an account of the range of views available in our political culture. No theory that respects the basic assumptions which define that culture could subordinate equality to liberty, conceived as normative ideals, to any degree. Any genuine contest between liberty and equality is a contest liberty must lose. What? I make that bold claim because I believe that we are now united in accepting the abstract egalitarian principle. Government must act to make the lives of those it governs better lives, and it must show equal concern for the life of each. Anyone who accepts that abstract principle accepts equality as a political ideal, and though equality admits of different conceptions, these different conceptions are competing interpretations of that principle. So anyone who thinks that liberty and equality really do conflict on some occasion must think that protecting liberty means acting in some way that does not show equal concern for all citizens. I doubt that many of us would think, after reflection, that this could ever be justified. Hmm, I'm not convinced. I do not mean that the abstract egalitarian principle is so empty or trivial that no one could possibly deny it. On the contrary, people might conceivably have a variety of reasons for rejecting the principle altogether or for qualifying it in an important way. They might reject it altogether by denying that government should take any interest in improving the lives of citizens. Or they might hold that, from the point of view of good government, the lives of some, those of one race or caste, perhaps, or those who belong to one religion, or those who are more virtuous, are more important than the lives of others. Or they might accept the abstract egalitarian principle but, but qualify it by denying that it is an absolute principle. They might argue, for example, that though government should show equal concern for the lives of all its citizens, it should also attend to other values not captured in or reducible to that concern. They might think, for instance, that government should also aim to improve the nation's power and influence, for the sake of glory rather than for the good of citizens one by one. Or more plausibly, that government should aim to advance knowledge or to protect and develop art and other forms of high culture, again for the sake of knowledge of art itself, and not for the role they play in making people's lives better. In that case, they might think that on some occasions it would be best, all things considered, to neglect certain political acts that are recommended by the principle of equal concern in order to pursue other goals. They might think it would be best, for example, to subsidize art with funds that could otherwise be used in economic programs that would bring the distribution of wealth closer to what equal concern for all citizens would otherwise require. Me. The abstract egalitarian principle can theoretically be rejected outright or qualified in all these different ways. But no significant body of political opinion among us would either reject it outright or qualify it in any way that would allow liberty to win a conflict with it. Rejecting the principle altogether seems out of the question for us. It is no longer arguable, at least in public, that officials should be more concerned about the lives of some citizens than about the lives of others. Nor does it make sense to accept the abstract principle but qualify it by supposing liberty to be an independent competitor in some pluralistic catalogue of political virtues. Some people treat art as a fundamental value independent of and competitive with abstract equality. They can sensibly think that only because they think art has value for reasons independent of the contribution it makes to the lives of those who produce or enjoy or benefit from it. People believe, that is, in art for art's sake, but liberty cannot, in the same way, have intrinsic value apart from the role liberty plays in the lives of those who have it. I mean to doubt that liberty can have inherent or fundamental value independent of its contribution to the value of lives. It can, of course, have instrumental value towards some other goal, like art or knowledge, that is itself thought to be inherently valuable for reasons that make its value independent of its contribution to the value of lives. I agree. For it seems bizarre that people's having some particular right, like the right of free speech, could be objectively valuable in and of itself, quite apart from the consequences of that right for them. I do not mean what is evidently false, that having rights is always good for people in the narrow sense of improving their welfare. Critics of liberalism often point out that people are sometimes happier with less liberty, and wise liberals concede this. But no one could be enthusiastic for liberty as something intrinsically valuable who did not think that lives led under conditions of liberty were for just that reason more valuable lives. because the more autonomous or more authentic are lives of greater dignity or better lives in some other way. So, though it might seem plausible that the value of art is not exhausted by the various ways in which it makes the lives of at least some people better, a parallel claim does not seem plausible for rights like freedom of choice in speech, medical treatment, or employment. If liberty is valuable because lives led under liberty are more valuable lives, then the egalitarian principle itself requires government to attend to liberty, because it requires government to have concern for the lives of those it governs. Then how can equality possibly conflict with an adequate conception of liberty? Only if two conditions are met together. One, in spite of the fact that liberty is valuable to people's lives, the position of some group within the community would nevertheless be improved, on balance, by eliminating some liberty. And two, equal concern for that group requires that this be done. Assume, for example, that poor people would have better medical care and be better off overall if private medicine were abolished, and that showing equal concern for them requires this. If government refuses to abolish private medicine, then, by hypothesis, the poor are left in a worse condition than equal concern would permit. Since liberty, we assume, has no value or importance except for the contribution it makes to people's lives, that result cannot be justified by citing some principle or goal unrelated to the concern government should have for its citizens. It could be justified, then, only if we accepted a principle flatly inconsistent with the egalitarian principle, that in these circumstances the lives of poor people are less important than the lives of others. Equality can coexist with art as two independent goals that sometimes conflict, because we can accept either as a value without contradicting to the other. But we cannot accept both that government must have equal concern for all lives and that it may sometimes show more concern for some than for others. That would be not pluralism but incoherence. We should consolidate this important point. There is a dark side to the issues that we are exploring, a shadow hanging over liberty. Any genuine conflict between liberty and equality, any conflict between liberty and the requirements of the best conception of the abstract egalitarian principle, is a contest that liberty must lose. We cannot reject the egalitarian principle outright, because it is absurd that government should show no concern for the lives of its citizens, and immoral that it should show more concern for the lives of some than of others. Nor is it plausible, for the reasons we just reviewed, to treat liberty as an independent value competitive with and sometimes dominant over the abstract principle. So we cannot, in good conscience, press for any right to liberty that conflicts with the demands of equality on our favored conception. Any genuine conflict is not just a philosophical discovery, but an emotional defeat. We have that important reason for striving to show that no genuine conflict exists, that no right to liberty we would otherwise want to recognize would be compromised by politics or conception of equality demands. Conceptions of equality. I said earlier that genuine conflicts might arise for some conceptions of equality and not for others, and it is time to develop that remark. If I am right, the dominant tradition of modern Western political culture accepts the abstract egalitarian principle, either as absolute or in some qualified form, then arguments about political justice within that tradition must be capable of being understood as arguments about what equal concern really means or comes to. They must be capable of being understood, in other words, as interpretations or conceptions of equality in the abstract sense. In fact, most theories of justice in the contemporary literature of political philosophy can readily be understood in that way. An attractive and reasonably complete conception of equality, a general theory about how a political community treats its members with equal concern, must be complex. It must describe political equality, for example, and equality under law, as well as equality in the distribution of material resources. I emphasize the latter aspect of equality in considering the conflict between liberty and equality here, however, because the supposed conflict is generally thought to be most serious when that aspect of equality is in play. In each of the examples I offered earlier, for instance, a proposed constraint of freedom of choice is defended as ameliorating the consequences of an inegalitarian distribution of wealth. I shall simplify my discussion further, without, I believe, compromising its value, by assuming that the conceptions of equality in play contemplate only private ownership of resources. A conception of equality, then, describes the distribution of goods into private ownership that would result from political decisions which together show perfectly equal concern for all, and which therefore count, without conception, as an ideal egalitarian distribution. We find many conceptions of equal concern in that literature. We find utilitarian conceptions which claim that a government shows equal concern when it takes the welfare of each member of the community into account in the same way by identifying and pursuing policies that promise the greatest average welfare in the long run. We find laissez-faire egalitarians who argue that equal concern means not interfering in anyone's life, so that, and except as necessary in order that, people's fates depend on their own abilities, initiative, and luck. It will strike some readers as Pickwickian to call that theory of justice egalitarian in any form. I do so to emphasize the important fact that those who embrace it can also accept the abstract egalitarian principle and claim their theory as the best interpretation of that principle. We find welfare egalitarians who insist that a government treats people with equal concern only when its policies aim to make the welfare of each person as nearly equal to the welfare of others as possible. We find resource egalitarians who believe, instead, that equal concern requires policies that aim to provide each citizen, so far as this is possible, with an equal share of the resources the economic structure distributes to them, measured by fixing the value of the resources each person has as the cost to others of that person's having them. Laissez-faire egalitarians presumably will never see a conflict between equality on their conception and the particular rights to freedom I said any acceptable conception of liberty would recognize. On their view, treating people with equal concern means letting them produce and trade under only such regulations as are necessary to protect security of person and property and the efficacy of contract, and so they will not think that equality could ever be improved by regulations on speech, by abolishing private medicine, or by maximum hour or minimum wage legislation. On the contrary, treating people with equal concern, on their view, requires respecting those liberties in full. But utilitarian egalitarians must concede at least the possibility of conflict between equality on their conception and those rights to freedom. They must admit that under some circumstances, protecting freedom of speech or political association, for example, will diminish rather than improve average utility. Utilitarians, in fact, argue that enforcing the basic liberties our culture recognizes is, as things happen, the best way to maximize average welfare in the long run. I know of no good argument that this is so, however. It strikes me as a whistling in the dark act of faith undertaken just to reconcile liberty with the utilitarian creed. Welfare egalitarians might also be tempted by the same strategy. It is, however, even more dubious that protecting the traditional liberties as rights will always be the best means of making welfare equal on any sensible conception of what welfare is. A utilitarian egalitarian or a welfare egalitarian, therefore, might well be required to disown liberty from time to time. Can liberty and equality conflict with that uncomfortable consequence when we take equality of resources to be the best conception of equality? That will be our main question in the next several sections. But I must first return to an observation I made about our sample cases just before we began these brief account of concepts and conceptions of liberty and equality. I pointed out that in these cases, many people seem to rank equality not only below liberty, but below a variety of other social concerns like safety and health. In my more recent argument, however, I claimed that equality has, for most of us, a near absolute force, and that it cannot coherently be qualified by supposing that liberty ranks beside it as an independent political ideal. Do the examples contradict that claim? We might explain the examples in various ways. Perhaps I am wrong in my view about the principled convictions most people would be willing to defend. Perhaps many more people than I think would reject the abstract egalitarian principle outright. But I offered another account of the examples that is consistent with my claim that very few people would, and I can now expand that explanation. People often use equality, as I said, in a flat sense, describe identity along some dimension indicated by the context, even when they do not believe that the best conception of the abstract egalitarian principle requires identity along that dimension. That linguistic fact threatens confusion when people with different conceptions of equality argue. When someone proposes that private medicine must be abolished, for example, in order to protect equality, he is plainly appealing equality in its normative sense. He believes that treating people as equals requires making their situations the same in ways that include offering them the same opportunity for medical care. Someone who rejects the proposal believes that the soundest conception of equality does not require that. If he states his view that way, then he suggests no conflict between liberty and equality. The argument is then about what equality requires, not whether equality should be subordinated to something else. But he may choose to state his position in a different way by saying that liberty is more important than equality, in which case he means that liberty must prevail over what his opponent thinks the egalitarian principle requires. He uses equality in the flat, descriptive sense to indicate identity and dimension his opponent, but not he, thinks crucial to equality as a political ideal. So perhaps, as I suggested, most people who say that equality must sometimes yield to liberty do not actually think that there is any genuine conflict between the two ideals as ideals. They mean only to deny that someone else's conception of normative equality is a sound conception. Even if I am right in this reading of popular opinion, of course, it does not follow that there is no conflict between the ideals. On some conceptions of equality, as I said, conflict seems likely. Our question is whether conflict arises if we accept the conception of equality I believe most attractive. We must face that philosophical issue directly. It is not decided, either way, by popular opinion or political rhetoric. F. A disclaimer. In the following pages I shall consider one group of arguments for the familiar conclusions that liberty and equality conflict, those drawn from the idea of distributive justice. I shall argue that if equality of resources furnishes the best conception of distributional equality, then these arguments fail. According to equality of resources, the rights to liberty we regard as fundamental are a part of aspect of distributional equality, and so are automatically protected whenever equality is achieved. The priority of liberty is secured not at the expense of equality, but in its name. My case for that agreeable conclusion will be somewhat complex, however, and will rely in part on a vocabulary drawn from economics. It might therefore strike some readers as too clinical. For them, the appeal of liberty is immediate and profound, and they are wary of argument that seems to make its place contingent on the intricacies of some dense dialectic. Nor could they accept that liberty is in some way instrumental or subordinate to equality. Liberty, they think, is the condition of human dignity and is therefore of transcendent importance in its own right. I should therefore say in advance that my argument does not claim to supply the only or the most intuitively powerful argument for the liberties I discuss, and some liberties that others claim as rights are not supported by my arguments at all. I argue only that rights adequate to an attractive conception of liberty are given so foundational a place under equality of resources that conflicts between those rights and that view of distributional equality cannot arise. In any case, my argument is not intended to subordinate liberty to equality, but rather to show that though we often distinguish these two virtues in political argument and analysis, they are mutually reflecting aspects of a single humanist ideal. I shall return to that large and dark claim at the end of the chapter, when I hope it will be plainer what it means. Bah, apparemment, j'ai loupé. It will strike some readers as Pickwickian to call that theory of justice egalitarian in any form. I do so to emphasize the important fact that those who embrace it can also accept the abstract egalitarian principle and claim their theory as the best interpretation of that principle. No. I make no effort here to discover how far my argument qualifies or expands my discussion of liberty in my book Taking Rights Seriously. It might be wise to point out, however, that my discussion was aimed at showing why utilitarian political morality could not recognize a general right to liberty as a trump over utilitarian calculations of overall social advantage, and why, to be plausible, utilitarian morality would nevertheless have to recognize certain specific rights to particular liberties. See Taking Rights Seriously and Dworkin, a matter of principle. Here I am considering the role of liberty in a different political morality based not on utilitarian ethics, but on what I believe to be the more attractive morality of equality of resources. The different strategies used here therefore illustrate the methodological claim about rights made in both Taking Rights Seriously and Matter of Principle, that rights cannot be identified independently of the overall politic morality in which they are meant to figure. Two strategies. A. The strategies distinguished. We must try to reconcile liberty and equality if we care for liberty, because any genuine conflict between the two is a contest liberty must lose. We should now distinguish two strategies for attempting that reconciliation: a two-step interest-based strategy and a one-step constitutive strategy. The two strategies differ in the connections they assume between the definition of an ideal distribution of resources, on the one hand, and the rights that constitute liberty on the other. The two-step strategy uses the idea of people's interests to define an ideal distribution. Each version of that strategy stipulates a particular account of how people's interests are to be identified and what function of different people's interests an ideal distribution aims to satisfy. It does not appeal to liberty as part of that definition. It does not define people's interests in such a way that liberty is automatically, by definition, among those interests. But then, as a second and further step, it argues that, as things fall out, certain liberties are instrumentally connected to the satisfaction of interests, so that protecting interests is the right proportion, or according to the right formula, requires establishing and respecting rights to these liberties. We have already noticed one example of this interest strategy at work. The utilitarian conception of equality defines an ideal distribution as a distribution that promotes the highest possible average welfare in the long run. That definition leaves open the question of liberty. It does not rule out, by definition, the possibility that utility will in fact be maximized by denying all rights to liberty. But utilitarians hope to show, in the fashion of the interest strategy, that in fact, given the world as we find it, protecting freedom of choice and defending rights to speech and other fundamental liberties are the best available means of achieving the greatest possible average welfare. The constitutive strategy, in contrast, builds liberty into the structure of its chosen conception of equality from the start. It insists that liberty must figure in the very definition of an ideal distribution, so that, for that reason, there can be no problem of reconciling liberty and equality. We have also noticed an example of this strategy at work. Laissez-faire egalitarians believe that an ideal egalitarian distribution cannot be defined except historically. The ideal distribution, on their views, is whatever distribution actually results from production and exchange conducted in the shadow of a political structure that protects the liberties they believe fundamental. So, as I said, laissez-faire egalitarians will not encounter any conflict between the liberties they are drawn to recognize and the historically generated distribution they consider ideal. They will not encounter any such conflict because, by hypothesis, any political decision that infringed their favored liberties would destroy rather than promote what they take equality to be. Contractarian theories of justice also generally use the interest strategy for bringing liberty into the story they tell. They insist that just principles of government are those that people would agree in choosing, as in their own interest, under conditions of choice specified in the right way. An ideal distribution, for these theories, is a distribution fully meeting the principles that would be chosen in those circumstances. The appeal of any particular contractarian theory depends on how those conditions of choice are designed. In the crudest form of contractarian theory, the principles of justice are those that actual people with full knowledge of their social position, tastes, ambitions, and moral and religious convictions would agree upon as in the best interests of each if they could assemble for that purpose. The interest strategy, for that crude version, would require demonstrating that everyone would in fact agree to principles of justice protecting liberty, or at least would agree to such principles after proper reflection. But that is very implausible. Why should members of a dominant majority of conviction, for example, agree to principles protecting the freedom of worship and choice of a minority as in the majority's interest, especially when the costs of protecting that liberty mean fewer material goods for them? A minute. John Rawls's contractarian theory is much more complex. In its latest version, choice conditions are constructed so as to reflect, first, a conception of persons as citizens of a free and equal community, each of whom has higher order moral interests in protecting his or her capacity for justice and his or her capacity rationally to form and revise conceptions of the good, and, second, principles of reasonableness suited to the political culture of Western liberal democracies. So parties to the original position, in which principles of justice are chosen, act as fiduciaries for other people, whose social and economic position, talents and skills, tastes and conceptions of the good are hidden from the fiduciaries by a veil of ignorance. Justice is fairness, political, not metaphysical. Philosophy and Public Affairs. John Rawls. Rawls's strategy for reconciling liberty and equality appears to be a mixed interest and constitutive strategy. In its original formulation, Rawls's strategy seemed to rely much more on the interest strategy. See John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. Rawls describes the changes between the original and the present formulation as made in response to H. L. A. Hart's criticisms of the original formulation. See Rawls' The Basic Liberties and Hart Rawls on Liberty and Its Priority, University of Chicago Law Review. Liberty enters into the definition of equality in the manner of the constitutive strategy in the following way. A political community treats people with equal concern when it respects the principle of justice that would be chosen by their representatives in the original position, and the conditions of the original position are modeled so as to assume that people have a basic interest in liberty. The fiduciaries of the original position are instructed that their beneficiaries have a compelling interest in developing and exploiting their own capacity for autonomy, their capacity to form, criticize, and pursue conceptions of the good life, and that interest plainly cannot be served in a community whose rules do not provide ample freedom of choice over at least important matters. Though this is not entirely clear, Rawls does not seem to rely on empirical claims about the degree to which actual people would in fact acknowledge that compelling interest. In any case, I assume this in suggesting that this aspect of Rawls's argument uses a constitutive rather than an interest strategy. But Rawls seems to retain at least a small element of the interest strategy. He suggests that the fiduciaries of the original position will rely on empirical instrumental claims about how people's assumed higher order interests are best served in designing particular rights to liberty. These include, for example, claims about the circumstances in which people will feel the confidence in their own powers necessary for self-respect. B. The interest strategy. The interest strategy, if successful, is appealing for a variety of reasons. It offers to put liberty on a secure footing by deriving rights to liberty from more basic assumptions about justice that do not already include those rights. The constitutive strategy, in contrast, seems dogmatic and unproductive. It simply assumes that stipulated rights to liberty are required by justice, and the strategy therefore cannot be convincing to anyone who begins by disagreeing with that assumption. The constitutive strategy that I described in the hands of laissez-faire egalitarians, for example, tries to win its position by fiat. It stipulates that treating people with equal concern means respecting economic rights that work to the benefit of those with talent and luck and against those with neither. That is hardly self-evident, but the interest strategy faces a different difficulty I glanced at a moment ago when I described crude contractarianism. No citizen with confidence in his own judgment would prefer to be without some protected liberty for himself, all else equal. I can be no worse off just having the right to speak in politics, or to make my own choice of willing sexual partners, or to march in unpopular demonstrations, even if I never choose to exercise these liberties in a way that, but for these rights, my society would forbid. As H.L.A. Hart pointed out, however, I may very well think myself worse off for these liberties being general in my society, that is, for other people's having rights of that sort. Rawls and liberty. I am particularly likely to think so at what we might call the margin of these rights. I would no doubt be worse off if no one in my community was permitted to discuss politics with others, even in private. But it hardly follows that I would be worse off if large and unpopular political demonstrations, which many citizens found deeply offensive, were prohibited in public areas. I might think myself better off, at least on balance, if the public funds necessary for policing such demonstrations were spent toward crime prevention instead, or toward better hospitals. Suppose the various liberties now protected by the US Constitution, or the Supreme Court's interpretation of that document, were separately costed in this way, and people were then asked whether they thought it would be in their own individual interests to trade some of these for other advantages that could be gained by abandoning them. It is extremely unlikely that most Americans would decline all such trades. Indeed, I fear that the majority would accept a great many of them. Contractarians wedded to the interest strategy might respond to this difficulty in various ways. They might claim that if people reflected on the issue calmly, with good arguments before them, they would in fact decline to trade part of their liberty for anything else. But that seems just another whistling in the dark act of faith. Contractarians might say that whether or not people would accept trades after reflection, it would be irrational to do so, but that seems too strong a claim. Why is it irrational for someone who knows that his own political convictions are conventional to trade off the general liberty of political demonstration for whatever advantages he believes this would bring him? Rawls's version of contractarianism does not allow people to make choices about fundamental principles of justice on the basis of their own peculiar situation or advantages. Its argument for liberty uses, as I said, a mixed method combining features of a constitutive and an interest strategy. The interest strategy seems at work when the fiduciaries choose a particular scheme of liberties as the scheme calculated, better than rival schemes, to develop the assumed moral powers of their beneficiaries. Rawls argues that fiduciaries following that strategy would establish rights to freedom of conscience and thought, of speech and association, and to various personal liberties that are familiar in our political culture. His arguments show how the interest strategy inevitably makes the place of liberty and justice depend on debatable assumptions about what people's interests actually are. He emphasizes, for example, the fundamental importance of self-respect, which he treats as a primary good that fiduciaries would aim to provide for those whom they represent. Self-respect, he says, has two elements: our self-confidence as a fully cooperating member of society rooted in the development and exercise of the true moral powers, and our secure sense of our own value rooted in the conviction that we carry out a worthwhile plan of life. Rawls, the basic liberties. He believes that fiduciaries would protect the priority of liberty, among other reasons, because self-respect is most effectively encouraged and supported by the two principles of justice, again precisely because of the insistence on the equal basic liberties. But some philosophers and sociologists insist that people are much more likely to think that their lives have value and that they have been successful in realizing their powers for justice and conviction in a society with a settled and relatively unquestioned common theory of the good life, on which they can draw for confirmation and reinforcement. These philosophers argue that in a more liberal society, whose public philosophy is avowedly neutral among conceptions of the good, the diversity of conviction and evident lack of irresistible argument for any part's views undermine the confidence that a morally homogeneous society promotes. Bernd Williams suggests that what might reasonably be considered knowledge in the area of personal morality is possible only in a society whose moral traditions are uncritically accepted as defining right and wrong, ethics and the limits of philosophy. Fiduciaries drawn to that theory of the conditions of self-confidence will reject Rawls's argument for the priority of liberty in so far as it relies on his contradictory view of those conditions. Of course, they will want to protect those they represent, who may already have formed unpopular convictions, from savages' forms of persecution. But they will see no need to create constitutional barriers that would prevent the community from achieving religious and moral orthodoxy over a few generations in less ruthless ways, perhaps by constraining the freedom of people with unpopular or challenging creeds to spread them by proselytizing speech, for example. They will believe that a community can develop stable self-confidence only by at least aiming in the direction of moral and religious consensus. Rawls might well be able to show that his own view of the conditions of self-respect, which supposes that genuine self-respect is impossible unless the liberties he regards as fundamental are protected, is more accurate than the competing view I just described. but to the extent that his dispute with that view is an empirical one, about what principles would actually be in the interests of people with the moral capacities he assumes, the place of liberty and justice remains hostage to disputes about what those interests actually require. And though it is of course no decisive argument against Rawls's version of the interest tragedy that many actual people disavow the importance of the traditional basic liberties to their own lives, even after reflection and argument, that fact nevertheless threatens any confident assumption that twice trustees would think these liberties in everyone's interests, even from behind a veil of ignorance. For it is far from apparent that all popular opinions about the value of liberty reflect only considerations of special personal advantage that the original position would exclude. Popular opinion may also reflect widespread convictions about what would be people's interests generally. If the rival constitutive strategy can be shown to be less dogmatic than it first appears, it might after all provide a better defense for liberty in an egalitarian world. 3. Can liberty be auctioned? Hmm. On va s'arrêter là.